Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Very excited for today's guest. It's an old friend who hasn't been on in a while because, he's just been, not only was he blowing off my invitations for a while, he was accepting them from other people at the Dispatch, including Sarah Isger when she subbed for me on this podcast a while back. And some wounds take time to heal, but he's back now where he belongs with me. Mo Elleithee, who is the director of the Georgetown Institute of Politics and Public Service. He was formerly comms person for the DNC, right?
Yep.
And we used to see each other quite a bit back when I was still at Fox. Are you still going back on Fox?
I'm not. I've been. I ended my affiliation about a year ago.
Oh, okay. Well, I apologize for not knowing, but I don't watch it as much as I used to. So
neither do I.
Yeah. So what we're going to do some rank punditry here. Why don't we just sort of start with lay of the land? How does it all look to you, Mo?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me back, and that you didn't take all of my snubs too personally. I don't know how to answer that question. How does it look to me? It doesn't look great, right? I mean, for those that are I do miss the days of exciting presidential campaigns where there are candidates that fire everybody up, and they may throw a lot of sharp elbows, but they at least appeal to some sense of national unity and identity. I feel like we're getting that a bit from the president, but we're not seeing a lot of that from the Republican side where all the action is. And it's been a perplexing primary on the Republican side up till now. Obviously, it's unlike any we've seen before. We haven't had a former president in the mix in this modern primary system ever before. So you knew he was going to come in with a certain set of advantages, but it looked at the beginning like he had a bunch of opponents who were ready to take him on and make an argument to turn the page, and they just haven't done it. So it looks to me like it's going to be a 2020 rematch. And, I don't know what they could have done to make it not so, but they didn't do it, whatever it was.
Yeah. Well, and it's possible there was nothing that could be done. Right. I mean, I agree with the person I agree with most on the issue of Trump is Chris Christie, obviously. Chris Christie is also the most unpopular Republican in America today. So
That's right.
And I wish he would, I really wish he would bow out and endorse Nikki Haley before the New Hampshire primary, because those numbers are looking like that would make a difference. Yeah. But so it's possible that there was no way for DeSantis to do what he needed to do.
DeSantis was never going to do what he needed to do because DeSantis was a good paper candidate, right? I remember right after the midterms when the DeSantis boomlet took off and everyone thought that it was a two-person race between Trump and DeSantis, thinking to myself, like, this guy did something pretty remarkable in Florida in his reelection campaign, kind of, but he was also running against Charlie Crist.
Right.
And he'd never been on this stage before. I felt like he was always going to be a one-trick pony and that he wouldn't execute it particularly well, and that's been the case. I thought Tim Scott might have a shot, but he ended up sort of not bringing his best self to the campaign. So really, Nikki Haley was the person who could potentially do it. You're right about Chris Christie. Politics is about the right messenger with the right message at the right time. He had the right message at the right time, but he was absolutely the wrong messenger.
Yeah.
And so it was really Nikki Haley was the one person who truly stood a shot. But I just don't think she was aggressive enough against Trump early on. And I'm not talking, she didn't even need to do a full Christie on him, but at least drawing real distinctions and appealing to the party's desire to win again. She just didn't do that aggressively until much later in the campaign. Incidentally, that's when she's starting to get traction.
Mm-hmm.
But she should have done it earlier, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see on that.
We'll see.
But like, I do think that and this is not to say, I'm not trying to say, and therefore the left is to blame for Trump, right? But I do think that when the objective historians years from now, when they look back on the rise and fall of the United States of America, they will point to the weird reaction, and I think irrational reaction, of a lot of Republicans to the indictments. And, the Republicans really started to rally around Trump after the Bragg indictment, and then it intensified after Mar-a-Lago. I think the Bragg indictment is indefensible. I think the Mar-a-Lago indictment is entirely defensible.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was a tactical mistake. Not like there's some cabal of left-wingers planning these things out, but in the macro sense, it was a mistake to lead with the Bragg indictment because it helped inoculate the right against all of the indictments, saying, well, this one is silly and political, and so therefore that was the mode they were going to, and maybe they would have received all of the indictments that way anyway. But in a climate where you have double-digit chunk of the non-MAGA GOP rallying to Donald Trump because he's been indicted for mishandling classified documents, I'm not sure messaging or timing by Nikki or DeSantis or anybody is going to matter in that kind of psychological distortion field.
I think that's probably right. And look, there's no way to know. I think DeSantis had a couple of elements of his message early on that he was not disciplined enough to keep that could have had traction if Haley had adopted them, for example. It wasn't, I'm more MAGA than he is, because no one can be more MAGA than Donald Trump. But DeSantis kind of flirted early on with a message saying, one, Trump didn't do what he said he was going to do. He didn't follow up on his promises. Number two, he can't win. He can't get elected. We need someone who actually can get elected, because he's just a guy. He's like, I've always said, Donald Trump reminds me of the character Pigpen from Peanuts.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the kid walking around with just a swirl of dust around his head. That's Donald Trump in chaos. He's just got a swirl of chaos around him all the time. DeSantis started with that, and I thought there could be something there. And even pre-indictments, talking about that chaos all the time, talking about the record of losses, right? Not just that he didn't keep his promises, but we have lost 3 straight elections under this guy. That could have actually softened the ground, I thought, for when the indictments came, right? The indictments would have been the proof points of this, but they didn't go there. And then oddly, I still think it's odd, they all jumped to his defense when the indictments came.
Right.
As opposed to leaning into, again, I thought Haley did this well the other day in her CNN town hall when she said, rightly or wrongly, this is the kind of chaos that will hurt us up and down the ballot in November. And so I thought that Republicans should have been leaning into that a little bit more. They didn't need to go full Christie and talk about Trump as a threat to democracy, although I fully believe he is. But they could have made these arguments to Republicans when the indictments came in. I couldn't agree with you more. You're right. There is no big cabal orchestrating all this stuff. But the Bragg indictment, the Manhattan DA indictment, really didn't do anybody any favors in terms of allowing oxygen for the others. Maybe. We'll never know if that all could have worked, but at least that was, I think, the best shot.
Yeah. I mean, just on the Bragg indictment, the point is, not that I think he's innocent of the things that Bragg is accusing him of. I mean, of course he paid off a porn star, right?
Right.
Whether it amounts to 90 cases of fraud or all that kind of nonsense, I don't know. But, there's this thing, my colleague David French has been talking about it for a long time, Trump law, where you have an exacting application of legal stuff of the law that you wouldn't have for anybody else, right? And I think you also have, Trump inviting this kind of stuff, because this is the dynamic of the last 8 years, is when you break norms, you give permission to other people to break norms to combat you. And then you get this vicious cycle of kind of thing. But just having a publicly elected politician who ran on going after an unpopular figure in New York City to make the precedent of prosecuting a former president, you really should make that be the most important drop dead serious charge, and not this thing that's all sort of atmospheric that's kind of going to go away. And that was the mistake of it. It was a collective action problem. It was selfish on Bragg's part. Obviously, Trump gave them the ammo because he's guilty, and no one was thinking about, okay, what is the law? It's the lack of that left wing cabal running things that creates
more
these
cabals.
problems.
What I'm hearing is we need more cabals, right?
So this is my thing, right? So like we'll get back to the straight punditry in a second. One of my biggest abiding complaints about right wing populist rhetoric is all of this talk about establishments. And the Republican establishment is keeping us down. The Republican establishment is stopping MAGA from achieving its glories. As far as I know, the establishment is like Mitch McConnell and 3 days a week John Thune, and that's it, right? And this idea, I mean, like, you must run into the equivalent on the left, where there is this widespread assumption by a lot of normal, smart people who are smart in their own lives, in their own things that they know about, but think that Washington, that there really is this secret room where everybody is running everything and knows what they're doing and can predict it. And I think that view of how power works is really one of the core psychological problems with democracy these days, is that people can't accept the idea that no, the voters really are in charge here, and that the donors can't stop somebody. The RNC and the DNC can't really stop somebody. It's a free for all.
You were so right on this, and yes, I think we do see it on the left. I remember in 2016, a lot of progressive activists, progressive Twitter, were talking about how the DNC rigged the election for Hillary. And I just wanted to say, like, I used to work at the DNC. We weren't competent enough to rig anything. Like, that's just not how the system works. And look, in the 1970s, in the wake of Watergate, we decided as a society that we were going to democratize democracy. Right? That we were going to get rid of the smoke-filled back rooms. We were going to completely gut the role of political conventions in choosing nominees. That everything that, these primaries kind of existed and they were cute, but they weren't really making any decisions. We decided to empower the voters through a series of primaries and caucuses to select our presidential nominees. It was one of the most consequential reforms. And while there was a lot of good that came out of it, there was a lot of unintended consequences, not the least of which is everything you're talking about. It completely gutted any sense of an establishment. It completely gutted the parties. Parties no longer were able to even, frankly, decide what they stood for. They just kind of had to wait until there was a presidential nominee and then just adopt whatever he or she said they stood for. They couldn't really vet candidates anymore to keep the loons out, to keep Donald Trump is antithetical to just about everything the Republican Party and the conservative movement said it was for, but they were completely powerless to do anything about it because of how we democratized this process. So, and it's not just when it comes to elections. People have this strange view of an establishment. It's what elected Donald Trump, right? His attacks on the deep state. And it sowed a level of distrust in these establishments that I'm not sure how we come back from it. It's not just government. It's not just political parties. It's the judiciary. You said earlier you weren't sure if Republicans were ever going to sort of accept these indictments. Mm-hmm. You're probably right, because for years, everybody in power was echoing the same message that the judicial system is rigged against conservatives. There's the same about the media, about higher education, about just about every single establishment that's out there. And I don't know how we come back from that.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's bigger, and like listeners of this podcast know, I go on and on and on about weak parties, and about weak parties create strong partisanship and all that. But it's also a function of the psychological underpinnings of populism, whether it's left-wing populism or right-wing populism.
Yep. There's
a certain archetype of an argument, which is that unseen, undemocratic forces are preventing us from doing what we want. Right. And what we want would be really easy were it not for the billionaires or the corporate interests or the special interests, or, in sometimes the Jews, or with the know-nothings, it was the British or the Catholic or the Pope in Rome, whatever. But it's always this idea that if we get into power, as Donald Trump used to say, it would be so easy to do, healthcare for everybody. Or, Bernie Sanders talks about how we could have Medicare for all and a Green New Deal, and it wouldn't cost anything, and it wouldn't be a problem, and it'd be really easy to do. But we're thwarted by millionaires and billionaires who are stopping it, right? And the perniciousness of that isn't just that it's not true. I mean, of course, there are millionaires and billionaires against any policy on the left and the right. That's not the point. The point is that they're not this organized group. But the problem is that when you say that there are forces out there that are stopping us from doing this thing that we know is right and good and just, and they're illegitimate forces, when you eventually get elected and you fail at delivering this stuff, you're not going to say, oh, it turns out this was really hard. Turns out that, shovel-ready jobs don't actually exist the way we thought they did, or whatever. You're going to say we were thwarted by these people, we were thwarted by those people, that the special interests prevented it, and so that we need to win another election, and then we'll really take care of these people, rather than just tell the American people the truth, which is that public policy is hard. It's about trade-offs. Mm-hmm. And there are good faith interests on both sides of every question. And we got to have an argument. And instead, it's always this sort of silver bullet. If we could just get rid of the people standing in the way, we could have our heart's desires. And that's actually not what democracy is supposed to be about.
That's right. It is that dynamic coupled with an anti-incrementalism, right, in our politics today. We want change from whichever side of the aisle you're on, right? We want change. We want it now. If we can't get it now, it's their fault.
Right.
And so that does not create an environment that allows for rationality. It's just a constant state of being pissed off at somebody else. We've talked about this before. This populist era has shown, I think, this trend we've seen maybe going back about 50 years, from politics being defined by left versus right to politics being defined by front versus back. People who feel like they're stuck at the back of the line against everybody who they see in front of them, actively trying to keep them at the back of the line. That's where the political incentive structure is now. And so our political rhetoric continues to make everybody feel like they are stuck at the back of the line,
right,
and that they have to take out everyone in front of them.
Right.
And that's just, I mean, we're seeing how that plays out in our politics on a daily basis.
So like, that's funny because like my standard line about when I'm trying to disembark from a plane, everybody in front of me is outrageously slow.
Right.
Everybody behind me is incredibly impatient.
That's our politics right there in a nutshell. Yeah.
So like it also, look, I mean, we're in the spirit of violent agreement about how crappy the extremes of our various sides are, which I'm not saying they're equal. We have different problems and all that kind of stuff. But since we're doing greatest hits here, I have such little patience when I hear whether it's an Elizabeth Warren or a Ted Cruz inveighing against elites. Because if you actually read elite theory, like the sociology of elite theory, Reddit, and all that kind of stuff, there is no metric, there's no criteria by which twice, 3 times elected U.S. senators, first of all, aren't elites. Former Harvard Law School professors are elites. Former Solicitor Generals of Texas, whose wives are managing directors of Goldman Sachs, are elites, and so what you get is it's very Roman, right? Where it's different elite factions claiming to be the sole voice of the plebs, when in fact they're just the sole voice of one faction of the public, and but claiming that everybody who disagrees with them, that the elite is homogenous and unified, and that that Ted Cruz is claiming to be one of the guys in the back of the line, when he's Cato or Cicero versus, Mark Antony. He's just one of the other senators. And so much of our politics dragoons in normal people to be sort of clickbait, foot soldiers, whatever, for intra-elite squabbles about who should be at the wheel. And which is fine, because there's no society, remotely advanced society in the history of humanity that hasn't had elites. You have to have elites because someone's making decision and resources and all these kinds of things. It just happens, right? But you need to acknowledge that you're an elite. You need to acknowledge that like that you're going to take the responsibility of being an elite and talking about it in a serious way, and not claim this mantle of populism so strongly that you deny the fact that you're in the room, right? It may not be filled with smoke anymore, but like you're a decision maker, and you're not powerless. You have agency. Anyway, I'm ranting, but it's the rhetoric of our democracy today from the people who are running it really bothers me.
No, I 100% agree. I mean, when you look at some of the most beloved presidents in over the last century or so, many of them were elites. FDR, JFK, even Ronald Reagan, right? Sure. He wasn't blue blood, but he became an elite by the time he got to the presidency.
Former governor and a celebrity, right?
And a celebrity, right? Yeah. I mean, an actor. And so, but they didn't pretend not to be, and they still were beloved, right? And that's one of my challenges and problems with all of this is, it's how my side actually focuses, I think, how it vilifies wealthy people and in the focus on income inequality. I'm not saying that the income gap isn't an issue and isn't a problem, and we can deal with that. But by railing against it, when I actually think the bigger problem is not that, right? I growing up, I never had a problem with wealthy people. Why? Because it's in our DNA as Americans. We all want to be wealthy, right? I want to climb that ladder as high as I can. And so go forth and prosper, brothers and sisters. You go be as wealthy as possible. Just don't pull the ladder up behind you before I have a chance to grab the first rung. The real problem, I think, is opportunity inequality, not income inequality. But because we're so focused on the underlying issue there and the underlying problem, and therefore, and always have to have a villain and vilify wealthy people, it's created a dynamic that I don't think is healthy in our politics. We all, I think all people in politics do this today, It's easier to have a villain than it is to kind of lift everybody else up. And it's created an environment where not only are we now anti-elite, but anti-elitism has given way, or has become, the lines have blurred between being anti-elite and anti-expert.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The people that are actually in charge, not saying Ted Cruz is necessarily an expert on much, right? But people are conflating that with the people who are actually doing the hard work of governing, the civil servants. And that's why you look at what, sort of how the right has vilified Dr. Fauci.
Mm-hmm.
And there's why vaccines are so controversial today. As just one example, anti-elite rhetoric by elites is sowing more doubt and distrust on expertise as well, which is further complicating the conversation.
Yeah, so I just, because I will hear from listeners if I don't put a pin in it, I just, on Fauci, I agree with your general point. On Fauci himself, I have an unpopular view from all quarters on this, which is that I think he was put in an unfair situation by the Trump administration because their original point person was the CDC director who completely screwed up the messaging. And literally, like, he went out and said, he was asked about COVID and he said, well, it could be not that big a deal, or it could be really, really, really terrible. Plan accordingly. Like, that's not helpful, And so Fauci was this guy who was trusted, who was good on TV, and they put him in this position that I don't think he should have been put into. And I do think it kind of went to his head. I do think that there was some instances of dishonesty on his part about denying any gain of function. And then it turns out, okay, wait, maybe there's a pinch of gain of function. And then telling people not to wear masks because he was worried about the supply. I mean, he was put in a position of pontifical authority, and then Trump allowed him to become demonized, even though all Fauci was doing was implementing Trump administration policy, right? And so he got caught in 1,000 different directions. But anyway, we don't need to dwell on him. But if you have a defense,
no, I mean, I'll say this. I think he is indicative of, I think, a big part of the challenge. Right? Experts don't mean being an expert doesn't mean you're infallible. Being an expert doesn't mean you make mistakes, especially in a situation like COVID where we're trying to react in real time and we don't know what we don't know. And so we make adjustments accordingly. That's who I want to be in charge, is somebody that can do that. Somebody who knows what we know, knows what we don't know, and is willing to adjust as we get more information. What I don't want is somebody like, a Ron DeSantis who says our entire approach to something like this is going to be driven purely by political ideology as opposed to changing data. And again, it's cast doubts. It's allowed us to cast doubt on experts and expertise. I'm not saying every expert is always right, but you want someone that's able to do that, making decisions. That's not where our politics is.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that there's always been a healthy tension,
sure,
in America between the sort of the cult of the expert and all that. All I want is people to make good faith arguments, right, about what they want to do, and respond to good faith arguments against what they want to do. And that's not what we're getting. Everyone's sort of siloed. And I'll give you a good example of this, which might help us segue back to the punditry.
Yeah.
I wrote about this a while ago. I just talked about it on Chris Wallace's show the other day. So in the Republican primaries, you had in at least 3 of the 4 debates, there was widespread agreement on stage that Joe Biden is killing the fossil fuel industry, that we are shooting ourselves in the foot by not developing our energy resources and selling more oil and gas, and we need to drill and all that. And I'm sympathetic with some of those arguments on the merits. The problem is that under Joe Biden, oil production has blown out all previous
Right.
records. It's
Right.
much better and much higher than it was under Trump.
Right.
It's not all because of Biden's policies. It has to do with some things that have to do with a global commodity market and things in response to Ukraine, whatever. But it's also just flat out a lie that Joe Biden has killed oil and gas production. Oil and gas production is going gangbusters in this country. And it's a very compelling message for Republicans to say. I mean, Tim Scott actually ran ads saying, it's a paraphrase, but it's close, that Joe Biden has shut down energy production in this country. Mm-hmm. It's just flat out untrue, right? But you know who's not saying it's flat out untrue? Joe Biden, right? He's not campaigning because he's got a base that wants to hear that stuff is true.
Right, right.
And so you have this collective action problem where you have the Republican Party lying about the Democratic Party and the Democratic Party not having an incentive to rebut it, even though I think it would be in Joe Biden's interest in myriad ways to point out that it's not true, that we are actually, the leader in the world in oil and gas production, and we are truly the leader in the world in oil and gas production. But he doesn't want to say it because he's afraid of his base. Republicans get to say it because no one will correct them, and it's what their base wants to hear. And so everybody's acting on false information.
I think the broad point is true and absolutely correct. Look, in this case, I do suspect you're going to hear Joe Biden actually push back on that because he's going to need to, right? In the general election, he's going to need to. And I think a lot of progressives will give him wide berth to do so, even if they don't like it. But your bigger point is, I think, absolutely true. Look, there's every political campaign, every political action we take as individuals is motivated by one of two sort of buckets of emotions: hope and aspiration, or fear and anger. One is cheaper and easier to mobilize than the other. It takes fewer dollars to mobilize people, right? I mean, look at any campaign operative will tell you this. It is easier to mobilize people on fear. It doesn't mean it's more right, but it's easier to motivate people's fear and anger than it is to mobilize their hope and aspiration. And so, and people themselves react more passionately around their fear and anger than they do their hope and their aspirations. They incentivize that kind of rhetoric. It's where the incentive structure is. And so, yeah, I think that's always been a tension in politics, this dynamic you're talking about. It has always been a tension in politics, but it's 10x right now.
I'm just going to put it out there in a devil's advocate kind of way and see in what way you take the bait. Joe Biden makes the argument that democracy is at stake, that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy. There are people on his campaign talking about going full Hitler and denouncing Trump. We can talk about that too if you want. And the argument has been made. My old friend Rich Lowry, I think, recently made it. Others have made it, that if you actually thought Donald Trump was an existential threat to democracy, and you had approval ratings in the low 30s consistently for a long time, maybe what you should be concentrating your energies on is figuring out how to find a candidate who has a better chance of beating Donald Trump than running again yourself. So what say you to this outrageous line of inquiry?
Look, I think there's a personal and there's a political response to this. Personal in terms of the president. I will say this first, right? Like, he was always going to run again. Mm-hmm. I think any notion after 2020 that he was planning to be a one-term president, I always believed that it would take some sort of cataclysmic event, a health-related event or something to do with his family, would be the only thing to prevent him from running again. you chase a job for 40 years and you finally get it, you're not going to just walk away with it. Plus, secondly, I think he believes in his heart that he is the only guy that can beat Trump. And if you believe it, how do you not act on it, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you truly believe that you are the one person, the only person who has defeated Donald Trump, and the only person who can, it makes sense that you would do it. Politically, I think there's a number of factors I think at play here that are worth considering. One, would a heated, competitive, messy primary, let's say Joe Biden was not running for re-election, would that be good or bad? Don't know. Right? Short answer, don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Would the party spending all of its money on a competitive and probably combative Democratic primary pitting the centrists versus the far progressives at a time when it was pretty clear Donald Trump was going to be the Republican nominee? Maybe there's an upside to that, but maybe there's also a lot of downsides to that. Whereas the president has a message, he's got a unified party behind him, and he's got an organization and all the money he needs to run a competitive race. And then the final point I'll make politically is, given how polarized we are, some of the dynamics you were talking about earlier, would anybody have stepped onto this race with a favorable rating greater than 42%? Right? And we start our politics at a tie now, regardless of who the candidates are. We start at a tie because we are just that polarized. And so, you know, I don't think we're going to see another landslide presidential election anytime soon, because people have just chosen their teams. It doesn't matter who the captain is. They've chosen their teams, and that's who they're going to be with, no matter who's there. So for all those reasons, I am not one of these doomsdayers who say if only Biden would step aside, it would be clear sailing. We got a guy who believes, I mean, whatever you want to say about Joe Biden, he believes what he says. He fully believes that democracy is a threat, is under threat, it's under fire, and that we need to make that a core theme of this campaign. You got, he's got a message to articulate. He's got the resources and the organization to run a campaign. I don't think he actually starts in much worse shape than anybody else would. If there was a Gretchen Whitmer or a Gavin Newsom at the top of the ticket, I think the polls would still look exactly the same.
Yeah, I just with the valuable caveat of we don't know, right?
We don't know.
But I think I just disagree with that. I mean, I think that this has a very 1992 feel to it, to me, where George H.W. Bush, people were just tired of George H.W. Bush for fair and unfair reasons, and the economy, that recession wasn't that steep, and they were basically pulling out of it by the time election day, but people just could not feel it. And it was a very vibe kind of thing. And when you look at like, say, Biden's approval on various issues, it really feels often that it's Biden's personal low approval rating that is driving a lot of the issue polling, because they just don't. If you ask, how do you feel about Biden's handling of X, Y, or Z, it kind of just tracks his approval numbers. And I don't think that that's how people actually feel about all those different issues or how Biden's actually run things. I think they're just kind of exhausted with Biden. But maybe I'm wrong. I'm
not sure that dynamic is any different than it's ever been in politics, right? I mean, when Barack Obama was at his low point in the wake of pushing through the Affordable Care Act, right? The Affordable Care Act was incredibly unpopular in polling. When you polled all of the elements of the Affordable Care Act,
Sure.
right? They were all sky high approval rating. People liked what it did. They just didn't like the thing because it was his thing. It's why I think Bidenomics as a phrase is problematic, because if we were to test some of the individual elements of what the president and his team call Bidenomics, I think those would do well. I think connecting it to him personally allows a little bit more of what you're talking about, as opposed to just talking about what it is they want to talk about. I don't think he should shy away from talking about the economy. I actually think he needs to lean into it to try to provide some counterweight to what the Republicans are going to say about the economy. But making it a personal thing at a time when he's got low approval ratings, it's an extra weight around it.
Yeah, I take your point about Obamacare. I don't remember in 2012, this time in 2012, something like 70% of Democrats under the age of 30 saying Obama shouldn't run again. Right? I mean, it does seem like he's got some tied particularly to his age stuff. I also I'm curious about this because I bring this up with a lot of people, and I think the Biden people have gotten better talking about this, but you still hear it from time to time from that crowd, and you used to hear it a lot. They would say they have the playbook because they beat Trump before, right? And my problem with that is that Trump was the incumbent, 4 years of chaos and being in people's headspace, COVID, whatever. And Biden had a perfectly legitimate excuse to run a basement campaign in 2020. Situation is just like, it's a different game, right? You can't do a basement campaign. And also you can't run on the promise of normalcy if one of the reasons why your approval ratings are so low is because it doesn't feel like things have gotten back to normal and you're the incumbent. It's just a completely different orientation to a race.
You can never, I agree with this. You can't run the last race. You never can. And it's a problem that way too many incumbents, to trap way too many incumbents of both parties throughout history, up and down the ballot, have, it's a trap they've fallen into. So there is a different thing to say. Real quick on the young voters, I think one of the challenges with young voters 4 years ago turned out big time for the president, for President Biden. And they were sort of this, can you believe what this clown has done to us message resonated with them quite a bit. It's different this time because today's young voters, particularly today's first-time young voters, don't remember what life was like before Donald Trump. Right? Barack Obama was a figure in history books to them. They don't remember the pre-Trump era, which means this style of politics that we are seeing is normal to them. It's all they've ever known. So
that's very depressing, by the way.
It really is. And, I work on a college campus and I do see it. Doesn't mean that they aren't aspirational and hope for something better, but they've just never seen it in their political consciousness. So we can't run it, to your point, you can't run that same race. And I think, I think big data in politics has made our politics so much worse, and we could go on and on about that. But one thing it has done is it does allow you to sort of give very tailored focus to your messaging to different constituencies. So I think there is an opportunity for the president to talk directly to young voters and talk about how democracy is at stake and how that's impacting the fight for climate, the fight on guns, the fight on abortion, those issues that we know are the most animating to young voters. He can do the same with black voters. He can do the same with every piece of the Democratic electorate, is give them sort of very tailored explanations of why democracy being at stake is bad for their community. That's got to be a big part of his strategy. If he's going to deal with some of those numbers about the core groups of the Democratic constituency being a little soft, He's got to make that. He can't just go back and run the same campaign against Donald Trump. He's got to show them how Trumpism and the MAGA movement and Trump's chaos will directly impact them. And I think he has a case to make. They're just going to have to be, this is a race that's going to be won with a scalpel, not with a bazooka. Mm-hmm. And that's what they've got to do here.
So I know why I think big data has made American politics worse, but I was sitting here trying to think, hey, what does Mo think? So why do you think big data has made our politics worse?
So earlier I talked about how every political action we take is motivated by either hope and aspiration or fear and anger. Couple that with the fact that every political campaign has two jobs, has to do two things. Every campaign operative is tasked every morning with figuring out how to persuade the persuadable and mobilize those who are already with you. Every campaign is an exercise in limited resources as well. So you have a finite number of dollars and you have to persuade and mobilize. One is cheaper than the other. Mm-hmm. It is cheaper to mobilize than it is to persuade. It is easier to get someone who is like-minded to take an action than it is to take that extra step of persuading someone to be like-minded. And so with the advent of big data, before big data became a thing in political campaigns, every campaign had to do both. They had to persuade and they had to mobilize. And so they were talking to everybody, except for those who you knew weren't going to be with you ever. But they had to have messaging. They had to, television advertising spoke to the broader population. With big data, they are now running different ads with different messages to different people with a heavier emphasis on mobilization. Mm-hmm. Every campaign, we are drifting towards all mobilization campaigns, mm-hmm. with much, much, much less of an emphasis on persuasion. If I don't have to persuade the unpersuadable or persuade the persuadable, where's my incentive to do anything but be hot in my messaging, right? Because being hot is what mobilizes the base. So you and I could be living we could be next door neighbors, watching the same program on the same platform at the same time, and we're going to get very different messages because mm-hmm. of big data and because of technology. But it is what's most likely is that if I'm persuadable and you're a base voter, you're going to get 3 times as many ads than I'm going to get mm-hmm. because it's going to be in their interest. That's bad for our politics. It is bad for our politics that the incentive structure favors purely mobilization campaigns than it does persuasion campaigns. It's why Marjorie Taylor Greene can say the most incendiary and crazy things on the floor of the House and then raise $3 million overnight in $25 increments, right? Because all she cares about is the persuasion, because she can run a more effective campaign all she cares about is the mobilization.
Right.
And that's bad for our politics.
So it's funny. I was on Inside Politics, the CNN show. And I said, about a couple months ago, and I had some, could have been more artful, but I stand by it entirely. The point, at least, I said, part of the big driver of the problems in our politics these days are small donors.
Yes.
And it became this sort of 15 minutes of hate Twitter thing where I'm an elitist, guilty, and where I'm against democracy and all these kinds of things. And I didn't budge a bit on this because I've been writing about this for a while, and it's transparently obvious to me.
Yes.
That the small donor thing is a real problem. I mean, say what you will about big donors, and I'm sure you know a lot more Democratic ones than I do, but I know a lot of Republican ones. There's some selection bias, but for the most part, they tend to be like pretty patriotic people who have well-formulated views about the long-term trajectory of politics and where they'd like it to go, right? About the kind of politics they want to see, about the kind of policy that they want to see. They're not they don't get freaked out about something that they see Tucker Carlson say and say, okay, I'm going to write a check. They have healthier democratic time horizons, right? And small donors, there are a lot of decent and wonderful people because you're talking about millions of people here, right?
Yeah.
But in the aggregate, small donors, the politicians who rely solely on small donors, they rely on making them very, 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 very angry in the moment. And so they dash off $15 or $25, and they turn themselves into commodities for these campaigns. And they're not looking at long time horizon stuff. They're just looking at venting their rage, and they support candidates who echo their rage. And that's bad for democracy. And the willful stupidity of so many people, some of whom would like reach out to me in DMs and say, you're on your own here, but I agree with you, was really kind of amazing to me. But anyway.
No, I'm with you 100%. Look, I think I'm not saying let's allow any billionaire to write blank checks, and I do think that while there have been a lot of problems with campaign finance reform over the years, that demanding transparency and I'm all for that. I do think that there was a big problem with big money controlling our politics for a long time. But the idea that small money was the answer to fix that, I think, is living in a state of denial about the impact that you just talked about. At the end of the day, I do believe your average big donor is motivated, gives because they want to win.
Mm-hmm.
Your average small donor gives because they want to feel.
Yeah.
And that's just a different dynamic, but it has not fixed the politics. Taking big money, balancing the scales between big money and small money has not fixed politics, and in some ways has made it darker in terms of the tone.
So I don't think I've ever asked you this, but like me and Sarah Isger and a few others here at the Dispatch, we are keeping the torch alive for defending Mitch McConnell on a singular point here. I know I'm not going to ask you to defend Mitch McConnell on Merrick Garland or something, but his complaint about McCain-Feingold was that you're not taking the money out of politics, you're taking the parties out of politics.
Yes.
And I think we would be in much better reporting, transparency, all that kind of stuff. Fine. Whatever, like follow the money kind of strictures you want, but we would have been in better shape in the last 25 years if the parties were able to pick their candidates better, or at least if you're going to still have primaries, at least support the candidates who had the best shot of winning in a general election, right? Of caring about winning. I mean, this is something that gets really sort of forgotten. Everyone hates partisanship, but what they don't realize is how much of both parties have been taken over by people who actually don't care as much about winning as they should, right? Which means for Democrats, putting moderates in purplish states to run. I mean, I remember when AOC's PAC group, whatever, announced that they were going to find the AOC of West Virginia, which is just not a thing, and they're going to primary Joe Manchin, in a state that Trump won by like 67 points, I'm a big fan of Roy Teixeira, my colleague at the American Enterprise Institute, and I think he's right about a lot of the problems with the Democratic Party. I think the Republican Party has very similar problems, and campaign finance reform, which was well intended, has ended up making it impossible for grown-ups to help keep their parties competitive in the country, which fuels all of these other problems that we're talking about.
Look, I think the party infrastructure has been so gutted between both the opening up of primaries and the empowering of those primaries and campaign finance reform. Those that sort of 1-2 punch has completely weakened the parties. Now, some people say, great, but I think everything you're talking about is absolutely true. Parties have lost the ability to influence who the candidates running under their banner are.
Right. Right.
They've completely lost the influence. No matter how many internet conspiracies theories there are about parties rigging elections, I promise you, if parties could rig elections, Donald Trump would never have been the
Right.
Republican nominee in 2016.
And Bernie Sanders wouldn't have gotten nearly so close, right? Because, I mean, he spent 20 years, 30 years being a pain in the ass to Democrats.
That's right.
And he came really close to, like, you know,
He
taking it
came
all.
very close in 2020. And so, parties just have lost that impact. And it's also given rise to super PACs to fill the void that many parties, right? They are raising money. At first, they were just advertising vehicles because they can raise more money and television ads were expensive. But now you're seeing more and more super PACs that are moving into the traditional functions of campaigns and national parties. They're running their own data operations. They're running their own field operations. I mean, hell, the DeSantis super PAC was like paying for his travel.
Right.
And those super PACs are not accountable to anybody, especially the candidate. They're not allowed to coordinate with the candidate. They're not allowed to coordinate with the parties. And so there is no accountability at all. And now we're seeing these public spats between campaigns and their own super PACs. It's completely a mess. And it can be traced back, I think, to those two decisions. One, de-emphasizing the role of parties in selecting their own nominees and opening it up entirely to voters, and McCain-Feingold campaign finance reform, which took away sort of the financial reason to have political parties.
Yeah, I mean, I tell people, I got asked when I was talking to normal citizens during the heights of the George Santos craziness. They were like, why would the Republican Party even let this guy run?
Yeah.
And I was like, because he paid the $35 filing fee and showed up at an event. And that's how it is, right? And
I took a group of students to London, Georgetown students to London back in 2017 to observe the snap general election that year. Mm-hmm. Theresa May, the prime minister, called a snap general election. It was a 6-week-long campaign. And so we wanted to see what it was like. And I remember I have a friend who's a member of parliament, and he took some time to sit down with our students and explain their process. What he said was, candidates interview with the local party committee to get a spot on the primary ballot. And it is a sort of your smoke-filled back room. Mm-hmm. 10 people come in. They say, okay, the two of you can run because you check all the boxes. You give us what we want politically. You are most aligned with our party manifesto, et cetera, et cetera. And then those two people square off in a primary, so the voters have a shot. Mm-hmm. And then once there's a nominee, the party says, okay, here's your budget. This is what you may spend. Here's the manifesto. Say it in your own words, but this is what, as our nominee, we're expecting you to run on. And here's where you can have some wiggle room. And then they run that campaign. And I was stunned, right? I was absolutely stunned at how different it was from our system and how reasonable it sounded as my friend was explaining it. On election night, my students went out into the streets of London and stood outside of pubs, interviewing Londoners about the election returns as they were coming in. Nothing more fun than listening to drunk Londoners talk about politics. But even the drunkest of them, I was surprised at how many of them could tell you exactly what was in the Labour Party manifesto, what was in the Tory manifesto. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm the most recent communications director for the DNC. I couldn't quote from the Democratic Party platform. Yeah. Right? The parties meant something there. They were helping to shape the election. They weren't cutting voters out. There were still voters were getting a chance in the primaries to vote. But they were helping to shape who was at least running under their banner. Right. And they had a message, a core message that voters could connect with. Republican Party in 2020 didn't even have a platform. They just said whatever the big guy wants. Here we are much more personality driven politics than a party or ideological driven politics.
So that's really interesting. I guess this is my white whale. This is stuff about the party stuff because Elaine Kmark was the first one to point it out to me, at least. We're the only advanced industrialized democracy in the world whose parties do not pick their candidates.
Correct.
But there's this weird double irony, which is that in parliamentary democracies, I mean, different parliamentary systems have different rules and all that, and like Israel's are basically just like wacky Japanese game show rules as far as I could tell. So we don't need to know about that. But the UK's are sort of understandable. And when you have a parliamentary system, you need really strong parties.
Yes.
Right. And what's funny is that in the States, and I've been making this complaint primarily about Democrats, but now it's bipartisan because Republicans have the same problem of candidates running as if we live in a parliamentary democracy without any of the restraints of the parties that a parliamentary democracy has. So like it first occurred to me, I don't know, 2 presidential cycles ago where all the Democrats were at some, I want to say like an AFT conference, and one after the other would say, on day 1 of my presidency, I'm going to do this. And on day 1 of my presidency, I'm going to do that. And the things that they were talking about doing, the president has zero power to do, right? They have to get Congress to agree to half these things, like Kamala Harris in 2020 campaigned promising to say that her first day in office, she was going to repeal Donald Trump's tax cuts. It's like, well, the president can't do that on the first day in office, right? But they talk as if we live in a parliamentary democracy when we don't. And it's funny, Paul Begala, I've become, if you had told me 25 years ago that I would become so friendly with Paul Begala, I would have you slapped your face. But I really like the guy, and we see each other every now and then in the CNN green room. And he was telling me a story, I think it was when he was working for Tony Blair, and he helped on the campaign, whatever, I guess it was Tony Blair, or who was the subsequent liberal prime minister? Anyway, someone like that. And he says, and they win big on election night. And Paul reaches in his bag for his hoary cliches of American politics and says, now comes the hard part. And the newly elected prime minister turns to him and says, actually, no. This was the hard part. But in our system, my party now runs the entirety of the government. There really are no broad checks and balances here the way that you have in your system. And I can just do basically whatever I want to do, which is not to say that he was going to do whatever he wanted to do, because there are political checks in the sense of like, restraints on what you can do in the Overton window of British politics. But like in America, the governing is supposed to be the hard part because we have this constitutional order of separation of powers that doesn't exist in parliamentary systems. And a lot of Americans seem to want to have the parliamentary system.
Well, it's interesting, right? Because in the UK, you've got 2, maybe 3 legitimate parties, so it gets a little bit easier. But look at some other places. Look at places like Israel, where you've got a bunch of different parties, where maybe 2 major parties, but neither of them can ever get a majority without building a coalition with the smaller parties. And so you get these wacky coalitions that are constantly fighting within themselves. We see that in Israel now. It's funny. You said we campaign like we're a parliamentary democracy. I look at our Congress and I think we sometimes govern like we're a parliamentary, to a multi-party parliamentary system. I mean, the whole saga that we watched play out with House Republicans this last year, I kept thinking to myself, this is like the Israeli Knesset. This is like having a loose confederation of right of center political parties coming together in order to win an election, and they haven't agreed on a single thing since, and we're seeing how that plays out. So we're getting sort of that multi-party parliamentary style governance within an infrastructure that can't even support that. So it's the worst of all worlds.
Yeah, no, I mean, and this sort of gets us back to the punditry part, which is that I think I really don't want to like declare it's all over. Nikki Haley's got some momentum in New Hampshire, and we'll see. And Trump, we're recording this on Tuesday, and Trump's having his immunity hearing, and people are texting me about how it's not going well for him. And I don't know if you saw in filing, one of the things he claims is that he did not have fair warning that trying to steal the election was against the law.
Yeah.
I think that's in the Georgia case. And because who knew? You know, like no one told me it was against the law. Anyway, so straight line projections are sort of folly. But I think the one of the fundamental reasons why this was such a screwed up primary campaign on the Republican side is because issues really didn't matter, right? Policy didn't matter. And that's what's happened. You know, when we were growing up, rhino was a term for people, for Republicans who were squishy on some policy issue, abortion, tax cuts, national defense, whatever. Arlen Specter was the quintessential rhino when I was growing up. And now rhino means insufficiently loyal to Trump. And it doesn't matter what policy positions you have. Mm-hmm. And so there's something reassuring about the debates in that the Republicans who were on stage were all arguing like it was the old Reaganite Republican Party. It's just the problem is that they were losing by 30, 40 points to the guy who's a rejection of the Reaganite Party. And I don't know how that gets fixed until Donald Trump is no longer on this mortal coil.
Yeah, well, again, I think this can be connected to what we were just talking about. If you've got weak parties and the parties have less and less of a voice in policy, in platforms, in ideology, then it becomes a personality free-for-all. And that, I think we have seen that to some extent on both sides of the aisle in very, very different ways, mm-hmm. right? But most starkly in the 2016 Republican primaries, where Donald Trump stepped out on the stage and on the debate stage, and every single one of his Republican opponents started attacking him for not being conservative enough.
Right.
And I think there were a plurality of Republican primary voters who just kind of scratched their heads and said, I don't even know what that means anymore, and I don't care. I think the system is broken and someone needs to blow it up, and this is the guy holding the grenade, and that's enough for me. And so because the party, I mean, remember, this was just a couple of years after the party established its autopsy report in the post-2012 election, talking about all the things the party needs to do. Policy doesn't matter in internal party politics as much as it used to do. Platform doesn't matter as much as it used to do. You can argue that in primary politics, it has never truly, mm-hmm. Because most of the people standing on that stage are going to be somewhat aligned on at least the big core issues. But Donald Trump was the exception to that. And I think it showed this trend that we're talking about, that when it comes to party politics, something else is driving voters much more than policy, much more than ideology. It is who is going to be the best voice for how pissed off I am and will provide me, election day now is like Festivus, right? It's the airing of grievances and who's going to best get my grievances. So can we come back from that? I don't know. We've never had an outsized personality like Donald Trump on stage before driving everything. When he does eventually fade, we likely will not have another candidate just like him. But everything we've been talking about sets the stage for somebody else with some other traits
for celebrity candidates.
For celebrity candidates.
Yeah, I think that's right. So did you have to go? I know we're a little over time. You have a minute?
Yeah.
Okay. Just because we talked a lot about Republicans, I want to get at least a little of my equal time in on Democrats. And I understand there's massive distortion field around Donald Trump in normal politics in all sorts of ways. But it feels very much like the old Democratic FDR coalition is on its last legs. And, Roy Teixeira and John Judas in their book, they make the case, first of all, that the Emerging Democratic Majority book was misinterpreted and overinterpreted by a lot of activists on the left. And then when Obama won, they thought it confirmed its thesis and it became self-fulfilling prophecy. And Democrats have been in trouble ever since because their point was never let go of that sort of New Deal economic populist, platform that appeals to a significant chunk of the white working class. And instead, there's a lot of rhetoric that took over on the Democratic side, sort of in this blue bubble kind of side, that basically said the white working class is racist. We don't want it. I'm not saying that every Democrat believes that, but at the level of messaging, there was a lot of that stuff. And we've seen just massive numbers of the white working class moving into the Republican column. And now we're starting to see small but significant numbers among black men and among Hispanics. Does that put on your, I know you're now in your ivory tower, but put on your partisan Democratic hat for a second. How worried about that do you think Democrats should be?
They should be worried about it, right? I mean, from a tactical, perspective in terms of campaigning, but also in terms of what it says about who we are, they should be worried about it. Somewhere along the way, you're right. I mean, 1992 was not that long ago.
Right.
And you look at the coalition that Bill Clinton built. Here was a guy who was affectionately known within the black community as America's first black president,
right,
but who also was winning over working class white voters in states that, if I were to tell my students here at Georgetown the states that Bill Clinton won, right, they would be stunned that some of those states were even in play, that some of those states were even competitive. He was able to stitch together that coalition. Even Barack Obama was able to keep much of that coalition in place in 2008. Obviously, he brought in some new folks into the Democratic fold and started to lose some folks, but still was kind of there. But I think you're absolutely right that, this whole notion that demographics are destiny, that I think Rue's right, was completely misinterpreted by all the wrong people.
Right.
It changed the approach. This notion that demographics are destiny, meaning that that minority voters and young voters are growing at such a rapid pace that if we just focus on them, we don't need white men anymore. We don't need people from the heartland anymore. I don't think that's what Rui was saying, and I don't think that's smart politics.
Right.
But it somehow allowed, in a very rapid, on a very accelerated time frame, the Democratic Party to change from being seen as the party of the working class and minorities to being seen as the party of coastal elites.
Right.
And I don't know why I don't know how that happened or how that's good. We tended to become a party focused on but instead of a party focused on and, right? Rather than saying, we can bring you into this fold, they were saying, well, in order to get you, we're going to drop somebody else. And that's just not smart politics. And I'll give you one more anecdote from my days at the DNC. In the run-up to the 2014 midterms, we were doing some focus groups around the country with undecided voters. And the moderator did something I'd never seen before in a focus group. He asked everyone, gave everyone a piece of paper and a pencil, and he said, I'm going to say a word, and I want you to take 15 seconds to draw the first picture that comes to mind. The first word was Republican. It's focus groups. You get all sorts of different answers, but you start to see some trends.
Mm-hmm.
In 2014, the most commonly drawn picture in these focus groups for the word Republican, any guess, Jonah?
You've actually told me this story before, so I'm not going to.
Yeah, was a dollar sign,
right?
Because they saw the Republican Party as the party of the wealthy. Flip it over. Word was Democrat. Most commonly drawn picture was a question mark.
Mm-hmm.
And that was devastating, right? The dollar sign for Republicans, when we asked them why, they said, well, the Republican Party is the party of the wealthy, right, the party of the elites. This was only 10 years ago.
Yeah.
That was the perception. I don't think people would say that today.
Right.
But when asked why they drew a question mark, people said, well, I guess I know who they're for. The Democratic Party is for black voters and brown voters and young voters and gay voters and women. But I don't really know, one, how they're for me, and two, what they're going to do.
Yeah.
And that is a troubling trend.
Yeah.
I actually think in some ways Joe Biden was the right guy to start to try to turn that around, right? Scranton Joe, he's got sort of that working class ethos and can speak that language. But we need more candidates at both the national level, and we need to start running more of those candidates locally. Ohio Senate race ended up not being as close as I, as a Democrat, would have liked. But I thought Tim Ryan was the right kind of guy in that Senate race to articulating the right kind of message. We just need more of that.
Yeah. And so, I mean, like, we keep lapsing into meta political science stuff.
Yeah,
but
sorry about that.
No. I'm with you on it. It's one of the reasons why that's hard now. And you can point to all sorts of things, lots of moderate Dems were wiped out during the Obamacare fights and all that kind of stuff. But at the sort of macro level, one of the reasons that's so hard is because Congress is broken and the parties are broken, basically all legislation gets voted on a party line basis, right? It gets the leadership office for the House figures out what the legislation is going to be and then brings it out like Moses with the tablets and says, you're all going to vote for this. And so Tim Ryan gets stuck having voted 99% of the time with Nancy Pelosi and that kind of thing. And you need more if Congress was doing a better job, you'd have the ability of moderates to actually find vehicles to express their moderation more fulsomely and tangibly. And that's true on the Republican side too, is that this impulse towards a parliamentary system imposes party discipline on really diverse coalitions, and then you get to say, see, they're all the same.
Yeah. And look, this is a real problem Democrats have to grapple with. Republicans have their own challenges, and not to change the subject, but they're facing similar struggles with suburban voters, right? And as that gap continues to widen between Republican target voters and suburban voters, they're going to continue to struggle to win elections. As long as the gap widens between Democratic target voters and white working class voters, it's going to be Democrats are going to face real challenges. So, and again, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier with big data. It was easier, right, to mobilize those base voters, those target voters, than it was to get some of those persuadables to the point where people that once were persuadable stopped being so. I think that was true with Democrats and working class voters, and I think that's becoming true with Republicans and suburban voters. And that's a problem for both parties and bad for our politics in general. I want to see more competitiveness. I don't want a bunch of districts that look more and more Democratic. I want everything to be competitive because then we're going to get better candidates.
Right. No, and it's funny. Josh Shapiro, and if you had told me a year ago, I would be saying this. John Letterman, or not? What is
Fetterman?
Fetterman. Yeah. They seem to get this, that you can be sort of very democratic, very progressive on all sorts of things, but there are certain things that are about the rule of law or government or whatever, where you just sort of need to be a little tougher love, more of a grown up. And I don't get why there aren't more Democratic mayors who aren't trying to be more like the Rudy Giuliani in the before times, right? Where you can be as liberal as you want on gay marriage and on all sorts of social and cultural issues, but quality of life stuff, crime stuff, making public parks a safe place for parents to raise kids. There's a really strong argument that on the philosophical level that the party of government, which is sort of what progressivism is or liberalism is at a philosophical sense, has to take those kinds of basic governance things very seriously. Otherwise, the faith and confidence in governance itself falls apart. And yet, you just don't see a lot of that out there. And I'm just like,
yeah,
why?
look, it's hard. There's no worse job in American government than being a big city mayor. The politics are you're just stepping out into a minefield from day one. But I do think that there's a growing number that see it and get it and are starting to move in that direction. They are seeing how even voters in progressive communities are kind of rejecting that progressive anti-establishment, right? Perspective. The DA in San Francisco getting thrown out, school board members across the country getting thrown out in very liberal communities.
Yeah.
Because they are more focused on an ideological message than actually, you can affect change. You can have greater police accountability without defunding the police, right? You can support our teachers without, pursuing some of the other things that the far left demand. So I do think we're starting to see a correction from that move. But the bigger thing, look, we all know the three biggest predictors of how a person will vote: their geography, their education level, and their income level. If I know those three things about you, I can make a pretty reasonable hypothesis of how you will vote. If you're rural, if you're lower educated or lower income, I can model how you'll vote. If you are an urban voter, if you are higher income and have a greater level of education, I can model how you're going to vote. What I urge both parties, the cabals in both parties to think about is, how to break some of those molds, because I just think it'll be better for our politics.
Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, I could keep going, but you've overstayed, or
I've overstayed my welcome.
No. I've kept you past the anointed hour, so I really appreciate it.
This happens every time I come on. We just get we work each other up, Jonah.
Yeah, But thanks again for coming on, and I hope to have you back.
Thanks, and anytime.